You are listening to a programme from BBC Radio 4.
Hello, welcome to Shared Planet. Now, the nearest I have ever come to an albatross is through the verses of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where, you will recall, the mariner with his crossbow shot the albatross. And as a result, the ship became becalmed and, like a painted boat on a painted sea, with disastrous results. But I have, like many of us, seen filmed images of it, gliding inches from the sea, wings practically motionless, effortlessly riding the waves like the sail of an invisible boat. But I was astonished to learn that this aerial mastery is coupled with a simply enormous form. I'd imagine a bird a bit like a large gull with extra long wings, whereas in fact, a wandering albatross is huge. It has a 3.5 metre wingspan, or if, like me, you struggle to speak metric, that's over 11 feet, making it the largest of all flying birds. And to put that into context, each wing is as long as I am tall. Now, the wandering albatross is actually just one of many species of albatross, and in the studio with me, as usual, is Kelvin Boot, the correspondent for Shared Planet. Kelvin, how many species of albatrosses actually are there?
The generally accepted number is 22 species. The largest of those is the wandering albatross, one of which was measured, as you said, with a wingspan of 11 feet 11 inches, although it is thought that they can get even bigger than that. But they're not all giants. Some species, like the sooty albatross, are less than half that size. They're generally found south of the Tropic of Capricorn, from Antarctica up to Australia, South America and South Africa. But 4 species are found in the North Pacific or on the equator. They can attain 50 years of age. One bird, a Laysan albatross named Wisdom, successfully hatched a healthy chick on Midway Atoll this February at the age of 63 years old, the world's oldest known wild bird. And it's been calculated that during her life, she's probably flown, soared and glided around 3 million miles. That's the moon and back 6 times, or 120 times around the Earth. An adult wandering albatross can circumnavigate the globe in around 50 days and travel 10,000 miles, wandering from feeding ground to feeding ground.
Are they more vulnerable when they're at sea or when they're on land nesting?
Yeah, it's both of those. This is a classic case of species that is threatened at sea and on land, and hence that's where conservation measures have to be taken to address both of those environments. All albatross numbers have steadily declined, some more than others, as a result of harvesting for feathers in the past and more recently from the depredations of introduced species such as feral cats, rats and even mice on their nesting islands. They're also susceptible to ingestion of plastic debris, which we talked about in a previous Shared Planet. And in the last few decades, longline fishing and trawling have emerged as serious threats to their survival. A few years ago, one estimate suggested that 100,000 albatrosses per annum, that's around 10 albatrosses every hour of every day, died as bycatch, mostly on longlines. And a survey over a period of 10 years of black-browed albatrosses in the Falklands showed that 38,000 had been lost from the population, an average of one adult bird every 2 hours. And it's their feeding habits that put them at risk. Albatrosses mainly feed on squid and schooling fish at the surface, but also discards from ships, which is why they tend to follow fishing boats and why they're attracted to bait on long lines. An easy meal, but one with often fatal consequences.
Well, thanks very much for that, Kelvin. And while filming for a new series for the BBC, Alistair Fothergill, the wildlife filmmaker, went to Steeple-Jason, a remote island off the Falklands in the southern Atlantic, where he encountered a colony of black-browed albatross.
This has to be one of the most extraordinary spectacles in the whole of nature. It's very smelly, it's very noisy, but if, like me, you love seabirds, it doesn't really get much better than this. I'm on the remote, rugged, windswept island of Steeple-Jason. It's about as far west as you can get in the Falklands archipelago. And in front of me now, stretching in every direction from this tussock where I'm sitting all the way down to the sea, for miles along the coast, are 170,000 black-browed albatrosses. This is a quarter of the world's population of these beautiful birds, and 65% of the global population of black-browed albatrosses nest here in the Falkland Islands. Now, each of the nests consists of a muddy pedestal, which was built over generations by the albatrosses. They're about 8 to 12 inches tall. They're about the size of a dinner plate on top. And there's an indentation on the top where originally the egg was laid. It's a perfect space to maintain the egg in place. But now the pedestal is entirely full, overflowing in fact, with a full-grown albatross chick. It's March towards the end of the southern summer, and it'll be a month before these birds actually fledge. Now, when you see them on land, albatrosses are surprisingly large. Out in the open ocean, where they spend 95% of their time, they seem very small, dwarfed by the massive waves you get in the Southern Ocean. But here they're surprisingly large. I mean, they're about the size of a small goose. And black-browed albatrosses are really, really beautiful birds. They've got a black back, a grey tail, and a snowy white body. Other than just above their eye, there's the most delicate black brow. It's sort of a smudge of mascara almost, put in place by nature's most talented makeup artist. It's almost too beautiful, really, to be just the product of evolution. Now, apart from the thousands and thousands of birds sitting here on their nests, there's a constant stream of adult birds gliding in from the sea. Of course, it's in the air that albatrosses really come into their own, and they're beautifully gliding over the colony now, crash landing, has to be said rather less elegantly, right beside their chick. Quite how they managed to find their chick among 170,000 others, heaven only knows, but they seem to. Now here in the tussock, just where I'm sitting, there's sort of an open area, sort of runway, an open sandy place. And some of the adult birds are coming back up here now, waddling up in a very purposeful way. They've fed their chicks, and they need to head back to sea. But the trouble with having such long wings is they may be fantastic for gliding, but they make taking off very, very difficult. And these black-browed adults here are using this runway. They're coming up, opening their wings, catching the air, and there they go, back over the colony, out to the open ocean, where they belong.
That was Alistair Fothergill reporting from Steeple Jason. Now, Dr. Julian Hector is a producer here at the Natural History Unit who did his PhD on the wandering albatross and has joined us here in the studio. Julian, when and where did you see your first albatross?
Well, I did my PhD on the wanderer, the greyhead and the blackbrow that Alistair was just talking about. And yes, I wasn't on the Falklands, but I was further away on South Georgia on a small island called Bird Island, which is off the northwest tip, which is probably the greatest seabird island in the world.
And what was your impression when you saw them? Because I had no idea they were so big. Were you astonished? You obviously knew it, but did it cut a special impression?
Oh, mate, it just makes your eyes jump out of your head. It really does. They are amazing. And in your introduction, you talked about how their mastery of the waves, and they kind of slope soar on these waves, their tips never touching the water, but only a millimetre away. But where I was working on these birds, on Bird Island, if you can imagine, as you approach the island and you get out of the inflatable and you start walking up the beach, the island is covered in lots of green slopes of tussock grass, and this tussock grass can be very deep. With the wandering albatross, the great big one, those nests are the size of dustbin lids as opposed to dinner plates, and everything is scaled up. And this island is often covered in thick fog. But as your eyes adjust, rather like you can see sheep coming through, the mist on the Welsh hills, you see these sheep-sized seabirds sitting on their nests. And there are many, in the wandering albatross case, many of these dome-shaped nests that they sit on, and they breed every other year. So in any year that you turn up, half the nests are empty and half are sat on by a wandering albatross. And it looks like these green slopes are peppered with like giant snowflakes of these great white birds sitting on their nests.
Sounds absolutely extraordinary. So when are we talking about? When was that?
Now, this is the 80s, the early 80s. I have not been back to Bird Island since then, but I've kept in touch, and the very nature of my work, I've kept in touch with many collaborators and scientists that have worked there. And I've seen photographs and had many personal testimonies of these very same places that I visited month in, month out over years. And that picture that I've just described to you of a landscape covered in wandering albatrosses sitting on their nests, all several metres apart. With the decline in wandering albatrosses, most of those nests now are empty. So you see a wandering albatross over here and a wandering albatross over there. So that green slope with wandering albatrosses nesting on it I described are empty.
Were you aware of that decline in the 80s?
No, we weren't. It turns out, and I feel very privileged to have done so, it turns out that I was probably in the kind of last years of the heyday numbers of albatross species in the world.
Julian Hector, thank you very much for joining us.
We'll be looking at how that decline has developed. Dr. Richard Phillips is an albatross expert at the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge and science advisor for the advisory committee of ACAP, the Agreement on the Conservation of Albatrosses and Petrels. And since 2000, he's been witnessing this decline firsthand.
The first counts at Bird Island were in the 1960s, and there'd been a gradual decline from then until about the mid-1990s, and then the decline accelerated. And by the time I went there in 2000, there was about roughly 1,100 pairs, and over the next 14 years they've declined to less than 800 pairs. This is of wandering albatrosses.
So a steady decline, and has the cause been this for the same reason throughout?
Yes. Wandering albatrosses are actually a very high breeding success, so there's no reason to think there's been any environmental deterioration. But adult mortality is very high now, much higher than you would expect, and that can be laid fairly and squarely at the problems that they experience in interactions with mainly longline fisheries.
And what is it about their feeding techniques that makes them so vulnerable? How do they feed?
Albatrosses are natural scavengers, so routinely they pick up dead squid and fish and so on from them close to the sea surface. So they have a tendency to follow fishing vessels which are discarding unwanted catch or discarding bait when the long lines are retrieved, and so the albatrosses follow the vessel in the hope of getting an easy meal. Now, of course, that means that when the long line is being set, so every hook has got a bait fish or a bait squid on it, the albatrosses are still behind the vessel and they'll dive down to try and retrieve the bait from the end of the hook, and they swallow the hook and are then drowned. Now, in trawl vessels, the issue is when the albatrosses are in the region of the net as all the catch is being brought up towards the water surface, and again they're trying to compete to get the odd fish that drops out of the net, and then they hit the trawl warp cables, and then they're dragged down into the water or knocked into the water, and they when drown or suffer other injuries.
You say they dive down to get the food. Do they dive below the surface?
In fact, albatrosses are quite poor divers. Wandering albatross can barely dive at all. Black-browed albatrosses and some of the other species perhaps go to 4 or 5 metres, and even the record depth, I think, is for a light-mantled sooty albatross at 10 metres. But in fact, those are really the extremes, and it's uncommon for an albatross to go to more than 2 or 3 metres below the surface of the water. And of course, that means that if you can keep albatrosses away from hooks as the line is being set off the back of the vessel, and if you can make sure the line is properly weighted so it sinks rapidly, it's actually relatively straightforward to avoid albatross mortality.
Does the age of adult mortality seem to be consistent, or is it random?
Well, in fact, juveniles tend to be more vulnerable than adult albatrosses, and that's partly because they have a distribution that overlaps more with tuna longline vessels, so their distribution is further north than the adults, and also because there's a suggestion that they're more vulnerable to being killed behind the vessel because they're naive, they're more likely to swallow the hook when the long line has been set than an adult is, and therefore they're more likely to be dragged under and drowned.
So we have an ageing population and they're not being replaced?
Yes, that's correct. We've seen a general increase in the mean age of the population of some species, and actually some species more than others, largely because there's a recruitment failure because many of the young birds, or a higher proportion of the young birds, are being killed at sea.
But presumably it's the fishermen themselves that are seeing both the presence and the lack of albatrosses.
Yes, that's right. Although the tricky thing is, of course, that although albatrosses might be declining at several % a year at some populations, they're still attracted in reasonably large abundances behind vessels, and so to the fishermen there'll still be good numbers of albatross in the areas, and they won't appreciate the fact that as a whole the population might be declining at 2 or 3% a year. And also, as it happens, you only need to catch 1 or 2 albatrosses or other seabirds per long line set, which may not seem much to a fisherman on board, but the cumulative total killed is enough to have a devastating effect on the populations.
Do albatrosses make any impact upon the fishing industry's catch?
In fact, although relatively few are hooked, many birds are attacking and scavenging and pulling the baits off the end of the hook before the line sinks to depth. So in fact, fishing efficiency is reduced because of the effect of this bait loss. So yes, fishermen do have a good incentive and a good reason to institute mitigation measures that will avoid albatrosses being caught in long lines.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Phillips. The problem of bycatch for albatrosses led to the development of some simple methods to prevent them from being caught. The Albatross Task Force was set up by BirdLife International and the RSPB to investigate the effectiveness of these methods and to lobby for their use. Ben Sullivan coordinates the task force, and I spoke to him earlier from Tasmania and started by asking him what these methods were.
In longline fishing, the most simple method currently available is to fly streamer lines behind the boat. So these are just bits of rope with a buoy on the end with streamers that move around in the wind and scare the birds away from the baited hooks. And using those streamer lines in combination with line weighting, so adding weight to the line means that the lines sink more quickly and makes it harder for the albatross to access the hook before they sink beyond the diving depth of the birds. And also night setting. So using night setting, line weighting and streamer lines is a really effective combination for reducing albatross bycatch in longline fisheries. And in trawl fisheries, it's really a matter of managing the discard, so the birds are attracted to the boat by the fish waste that is discarded from the vessel, and by flying streamer lines, again, from the stern of the vessel, it keeps the birds away from the cables, so they are the big sort of steel cables which attach the net to the vessel, and as the vessel pitches and rolls, the albatross get struck by these cables and get killed or have their wings broken. And so again, streamer lines and management of the fish waste that comes from the vessel is the most effective way to reduce bycatch in trawl fisheries.
This is very low-tech stuff. Is there any resistance to using it? It can't be very expensive.
No, it's not very expensive. They're quite cheap to buy. There is an operational cost. I mean, fishermen often don't like, doing extra things, but it is fairly simple. It is fairly low-tech, as you say. There are a range of reactions, obviously. Like everything, there's really good operators and not so good operators. So some fishermen are very keen to use these measures. They don't want to kill seabirds, and they're interested in improving fishery sustainability, and so they're quite happy to sort of come on board and use these measures. And others are more resistant, and that's where it takes quite a bit of advocacy and working with industry and government. One, to get regulations changed so fishermen have to use these measures, and then to work with fishermen to show them actually that they're cheap to use and they're highly effective. But there are also some more high-tech sort of new innovative measures which are sort of coming online in the next year or so. And one is a project that the RSPB and BirdLife's been working on with a UK company to develop something called a hook pod. And this is a small device which actually has a pressure release mechanism in it. So for pelagic longline fisheries, they're fisheries that target tuna and swordfish around the world. The fisherman simply loads the hook into this small polycarbonate pod. So the barb and the point of the hook is disarmed, so the seabirds can't access it when it leaves the stern of the vessel. And then as it sinks, it has a pressure release mechanism, and that opens up and releases the hook to fish once it gets to about 10 or 20 metres of depth. So there are some more, I guess you'd say, high-tech and innovative solutions which aren't far away from being ready for uptake in fisheries around the world.
Is money the main problem in people resisting using these techniques, or is it a cultural thing?
It's really a cultural thing, I think, more. Obviously, fishermen are businessmen and the bottom line's important, but it's changing the fishing practices and changing the mindset of people that they can use these devices. And it's critically important that we demonstrate to fishermen that not only will they reduce albatross and seabird bycatch, but it means that they will not reduce the target catch rate. So using these devices doesn't actually have an impact on the fish that they catch. That's a really critical part of the science that we collect to demonstrate to fishermen that these things are simple and effective.
Well, talking about simple and effective, have you got any examples of where they have been very effective and where they are working?
Yeah, absolutely. About 6 years ago, the RSPB and BirdLife International set up a project called the Albatross Task Force. And this is a team of people around the world. We're working in 8 countries, typically in seabird bycatch hotspots of the world. So we have teams in 6 countries in South America and also 2 countries in Southern Africa, The task force has had some really good successes in the last few years. In South Africa, for example, in the hake trawl fishery, so that's a large industrial scale trawl fishery that operates in South Africa, they were killing around 14 to 15,000 birds a year. And with the simple adoption of streamer lines and also managing the discard that comes from the vessel, the task force has managed to reduce albatross bycatch in that fishery by 99%, which is a pretty amazing achievement. And that's a reduction that's been sustained over a few years now. So it just demonstrates that really simple techniques can be highly effective with the right combination of the Albatross Task Force people working with fishery and also engaging with government to bring change around. There are also some other really good successes coming online from the Albatross Task Force work. We've had some really good regulation change in Brazil to require fishermen in longline fisheries there to adopt what we call best practice mitigation, so this combination of night setting, line weighting and streamer lines. And also in Namibia, which is a really critical fishery for albatross and seabird bycatch. Those fisheries combined kill around 30,000 birds a year. And through the work of the task force, we've actually demonstrated that we can reduce that to negligible levels, and the government is about to bring in some new regulations there, which will mean that potentially over the next few years we can have a similar success to what we've had in South Africa, and we hope to replicate that in Brazil and also in the trawl fisheries in Argentina and Chile that we're working in.
How important is the effect of bycatch on albatross populations? And I suppose that begs the question that if you go on having the success that you've just outlined, will this reverse the decline?
Yeah, absolutely. There's very good evidence to show that bycatch in fisheries is the driving force for the decline of many albatross populations. Currently there's 22 albatross species and 15 of those are threatened with extinction under the IUCN criteria. So we can actually halt these declines and help these populations to recover.
Which species seem to be showing most success?
The black-browed albatross in the Falkland Islands was considered endangered 5-6 years ago and has now been reduced to vulnerable. So that's the trajectory of that population is heading in the right direction, which is great. And there are signs that a few other populations, the declines may be starting to level out. So we're very hopeful that in the next 5 to 10 years that there will be a reduction in the number of albatrosses that are threatened with extinction. It obviously takes a few years for a reduction in bycatch at sea to actually be reflected in the colony counts that are conducted in the breeding sites, but there are some very promising signs that this may be starting to happen for some of these species. But obviously there's some others which are still in a fairly dire situation.
Thank you very much, Ben Sullivan of the RSPB's Albatross Task Force. As we've heard, South Africa has been the leading force in legislating for reducing albatross bycatch. And I spoke to Russell Hall from Cape Town, the fleet executive of Sea Harvest, a company which trawls for hake and is part of the Responsible Fisheries Alliance in South Africa.
In 2006, using the tory lines was mandatory. There was a lot of problems in the ensuing years immediately after its introduction into the fleet, and there were a number of issues and concerns that were raised. And the RFA, and Sea Harvest as part of the RFA group, participated in a really rewarding project to improve the effectiveness of the tory lines and to make the further changes mandatory further down the line.
What were the initial problems?
The initial problems after the introduction was the observer data program was picking up that there wasn't 100% compliance, number one. The other issue was that certain fishing activities were excluded from the data set. Another problem that was picked up, and probably the most important problem, was that during the setting process, when we shoot our gear and set our gear, that period, the observer data showed, was when the seabirds were at the highest risk, and that was in fact the period when tory lines were not being flown. So these are the kind of problems that were picked up in the few years after the introduction and were eventually put at the doorstep of the RFA to resolve.
And how did the people having to operate this, the fishermen themselves, how did they react?
I think once we embarked on the RFA program, what the RFA did, Monty, was they set up a seabird task team. The next step was to go out to these vessels at sea and with the skipper's participation and actually assess the tory line and the mitigation measures on board. And I think that process itself was probably the most successful because the issues were dealt with on the water with skippers. Skippers for the first time really had insight into what the interactions were. I think to a large extent in 2006 when these measures were first introduced, there was some disbelief from skippers who are a long way away from the interaction area, the danger area, and they were being told that they were killing seabirds, and they couldn't see that. They actually didn't recognize it until they went through an initiation process and video footage and was explained to them, and they had the first chance to actually physically go down to the deck and observe interactions, so that it became known. And I think once that change had occurred, once that realization and understanding of the problem was there, we were halfway there to resolving the issues.
Thank you, Russell Hall. Kelvin, it does seem that more and more countries are signing up to enforce the use of these very reasonable methods to reduce albatross bycatch. Does this mean that the fishing industry is generally working towards more sustainable practices?
Well, yes, as far as the regulated fishing industry is concerned, we've heard that some parts actually are. But there's always this great unknown of the unregulated fishery. And of course, it's not just long lines. Trawling also takes a heavy toll. And there are still too many mammals and birds and non-target species like sharks getting tangled or hooked. In fact, we've looked at some of these on Shared Planet in the past. As far as albatrosses are concerned, there's still a long way to go, and the battle is far from over. I spoke to David Stroud of the UK's Joint Nature Conservation Committee. He told me that as far as he was concerned, the albatross problem was still pretty massive, with more species declining than increasing. But, overall, this is a good news story. The problem's not been completely solved, but for some species, it's been greatly reduced. And what's especially encouraging is that the albatross examples show that what seems an intractable problem can actually have a solution. So these simple and relatively inexpensive measures might add a bit of time to the fishing activity. They might add a few dollars to each long line or trawl, but they pay dividends in the long term. The point's proven, really. It just needs to be accepted, speeded up and introduced on a much wider scale. And of course, continued development of other methods to avoid bycatch of albatrosses is essential, particularly to minimise impacts in conditions where some of the methods we've heard about don't actually work. Above all, it shows that a little cooperation can ensure that instead of facing an inevitable gloomy future, we now see that albatrosses and people can share this part of the planet.
Thanks very much, Kelvin. Well, that's it for this week. Do get in touch if you have any comments on this particular subject or indeed any of the episodes of Shared Planet, and you'll find all our contact information on our webpage. Just go to bbc.co.uk/nature and then follow the signs for Shared Planet. And next week we're looking at the European beaver and the very beneficial role that it can have for our wetlands. Until then, goodbye.
You can download many more BBC Radio 4 programmes for free. Find these at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.